We've got Dan Plumley coming on, one of the academics that we rely on for cutting edge information. Dan was superb at the Football Transfer Forum 11. He did a talk about profit and sustainability rules, and Dan's going to present to us. Hi, Dan. How are you doing?
Hi, both. You okay?
Good, thank you.
We're very good. It was good to see you at the Football Collective up in Newcastle recently. Did you enjoy that?
Yeah, I did. I thought it was a brilliant event, and I'm sure there's some people on the call today. So yeah, fantastic little network and really good couple of days.
Yeah, and the next one, I'm hearing it's Belfast. Is that right, Dan?
It's not for me to comment on that one,
Oh.
Tony. I don't think I'm not hosting the show. So if it is,
All
to be
right.
there, I'm
Oh, well,
sure
that must be
that'll be
just on my wish list, because it's sort of it's that I've never had a night out in Belfast, and I've done Dublin. So if it's that, or it could be Middlesbrough maybe, Teesside University maybe, that would be good.
Dan, I like your absolutely classic academic setup for the webinar.
Oh,
You've got the books.
Yeah,
you've got the desk. You've got the whiteboard there.
Yeah.
It's your classic academic setup. I love it.
Do you know what, Ryan? I need to be on campus today, so it wasn't deliberate. I absolutely have to be on campus, but it is always nice to do these things. Yeah, with the bookshelf behind.
Yeah. We're going to go for a poll first of all. We're going to start with a poll, Dan, and it relates exactly to what you're going to be speaking to. And what we're going to ask people is, we're going to ask our audience, and look, it's all anonymized, so nobody knows what answers you put down. But we're going to ask the question, launch the poll, Ryan. We're going to ask the question, who is going to be busiest in the January transfer window in the Premier League, the English Premier League? So we've got all the clubs listed. I think I did them in league order. So we've got factors at play like PSR, which Dan's going to talk about, factors in play like new managers.
Yeah.
We've got factors in play like squad rotation, people going out.
City's relegation form.
Yeah, we won't mention Man City. They might be looking at championship players. No, joking aside. But, obviously there's a lot of guys from clubs here. It's all anonymized. Don't worry about it. Stick your three. You've got three choices, so make three choices, and we'll sort of get a feeling from a group think.
Yes.
Is that the group think? Is that another band from the?
It's not another. No.
Group think. I think that's a good band name.
Yeah.
Group think.
Right. So we'll give that another 30 seconds or so.
Dan, you don't vote because you know what's going to happen. You have a better idea than most of what's going to happen, Dan.
The predictions must have been okay in May when we were at the Etihad, because you've invited me back, so we can't have been too far wrong as a group, could we?
Seriously, Dan, you called that little flurry of transfer activity in June that nobody expected and nobody saw coming. The clubs got together and made some transfer deals to balance the books, and that was a really great shout that we learnt about at the last Football Transfer Forum. So
okay, last 10 or 15 seconds then, guys, and then we'll close this off.
I don't think, there's nobody voted for Liverpool. They must be, they've already, they're several points clear. Do they need much?
The final fans last night at the game spent about 20 minutes just singing Arne Slot songs to the Man City fans.
Oh, really?
Which was incredible. Okay, we'll end that there and we'll share it out. So 11% for City. Is there any money left in the world for Chelsea to spend? There must be.
Is there enough room in the changing room at Chelsea? Newcastle there. Oh, well, there you go. Man United.
Yeah. Nothing for no one for Wolves at Ipswich. So it looks like the top three would be Man United.
Forest are always active, aren't they? Forest, hopefully Brassey's on today. Chris Brassey's on.
And Chelsea.
He's quite he likes to spend a bit of money, doesn't he? So let's just see. So Dan, you're going to present for 20 minutes and then you're going to open up for questions.
Okay, yeah. Well, as I said, thanks for having me back both. It's always a pleasure. And as we said, Etihad version of this a few months ago, it was great to get around the room and look at what was going on in the market and try and make some accurate predictions. So here we go again, part science, part art, as always, as you've alluded to. And for those of the room that don't know me, my name's Dan Plumley. I'm a principal lecturer in sport finance at Sheffield Hallam University. Been teaching and researching football finance and other sports now for the thick end of 12 years, and do a lot of work with the media and consultancy as well in the space. If anybody's not connected with me before, please feel free to reach out. Always great to make some new connections. But let's get straight into this then. So what I've done here, just to set the scene, is we'll talk about English football more broadly, of course, PSR as in the title of the brief, and also then with the January transfer window. What we see historically, just to context this, and you can see here fairly clearly on the graphic, is that the winter window is always more quiet than the summer window. And we saw last year in particular, if we just look at the most recent figure of £96 million, this is Premier League spending, £96 million spent in January 2024. Principally, a lot of that was around PSR primarily. And you'll remember, of course, as well, that the Everton case and the Nottingham Forest case were very much front and centre at that point in time. And the PSR thing kind of as an area was starting to bite more than it ever has before. And we'll talk a little bit about the football regulator as well. And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit of Q&A on that. But if you look at that across the board from a kind of prediction model, the trend is that January tends to be a little bit quieter for a variety of reasons. It's certainly, we kind of look at, again, 2023 there as a bit of an outlier in that data, and the record spend in that particular winter window, but also record spend in that summer window as well. And it tailed off a little bit in the summer just gone, but still in the region of £2 billion. But overall, much quieter in January. And that'll kind of lead into conversations about risk and risk management, and which clubs might look to shake things up a little bit, and the reasons for doing that in a kind of more short-term vision than a long-term vision. But let's focus on PSR in that context. And I mentioned 2024 was the time when it really seemed to bite hard. And what I've done here is, as close as we can get, I know there's a lot of numbers on this slide, and there's a challenge from the outside looking in with this data in multiple ways. The first one is this is taken from the annual accounts, which are always a year out of date. So in real time, we have got, the clubs will have the 2024 data, and they'll also be working, of course, in cycle. So the league and the regulatory governing bodies will be looking at this more in real time than we are now. But the overall situation doesn't always necessarily change too much club to club, particularly if they are in a loss-making cycle. You'll get some volatility as always, but for the most part, we can kind of see where clubs are at. So what this table is showing, I've included the current 20 Premier League clubs plus the 3 that were promoted most recently. The COVID year and year and a half is still impacting the PSR calculation at this point in time. So you'll note that the 2020 and 21 seasons are averaged out, which is what the league chose to do for the purpose of reporting. I've also included the COVID impact where I can find that information, and it is stated by the clubs. If the club haven't stated or it's not available, then that's where there is no figure included. So again, this is as close as we can get it, that kind of part science, part art conversation. And this is ranked in from top to bottom in order of kind of best on the board, the PSR calculation across the 3 years that is most healthy, and of course towards the bottom there, least healthy. So you can draw your eyes to certain clubs that are of interest within that framework. I'll just pick out a couple so you can see the mechanisms. I think what's interesting for me is that the PSR calculation in the 4th column of the numbers is based on the financial data from the accounts. If you look at the COVID impact, and there's other things there that come in around what could be adjusted, we'll know Everton's COVID impact of a claim of about 228 million. But if you look at some of the other figures on the board, that goes back to the certainly the perception and also the reality of how that case played out, that was artificially inflated in most people's opinions, and that was principally around PSR. And as Tony and Ryan mentioned when we jumped on the call, we've got Nottingham Forest in there, we've got Chelsea, Newcastle, with you know, particularly the ones that we thought were close to the wire, Aston Villa as well, who did that kind of transfer swap in and around the 30th of June, and of course Leicester City since then getting off on the Premier League charges linked to the way they were filing their accounts and moving the year-end date around a little bit. So that's the picture across the board there. And what I've tried to do with this, and I thought the poll there, I didn't know that was coming, by the way, but it's a great little setup for what follows. So here we go then. Those that can spend, and I've said in theory, because reality, as we'll see at the end of this little slideshow, is often very different. So those that can spend in theory, Brighton, very healthy against PSR, and we know the sales that they've made in the past, principally funded by Chelsea a lot of the time as well, which has helped, and some of those fees, but they are in a very good position based on that particular data that we can see. We've got the big clubs are in here, and I'll caveat that with the reasons why. Liverpool, despite the fact that, as Tony was saying, might feel that they don't need to spend, depending on how the title race is looking come January, but can spend for sure, and always can. West Ham are an interesting one within that mix, and there's always that conversation about individual clubs and where they are at, which we'll come back to. Brentford were high on that list as well in terms of a relatively healthy position. And then we've got the ones that we expect to be able to spend at any point, even if they have been making losses over the last couple of years. Those clubs that are protected with Champions League or Europa League money, the biggest clubs in the league. And even though, as I say, the position might not always be one of profit making, they're always the type of clubs that you would expect to be able to go into the market just because of the power dynamics of English football and the power of the Premier League and those clubs. And we'll put a huge question mark there on Manchester City as well. And it was interesting to look at the poll. Financially, can always spend, for sure. The caveat with City, of course, is a very big one, and that's the overarching case with the Premier League and what they do this season, and that'll be an interesting one to look at, given where they are in January, of course, given the current run of form as well. So let's put a question mark on City that we might come back to. Those that should probably not, and again, the caveat here is should probably not, but in reality might as well. Leicester City, we talked about their particular issues and where they've been at with the Premier League case as well on return to the Premier League. The obvious ones again, Chelsea, Everton, Nottingham Forest, Aston Villa, Newcastle, and Fulham are one that we've not talked about really. They've not come under the scope too much, but their PSR position hasn't been overly great in the last few years, and that again is a bit of a question mark. Now I'm saying this with the caveat because that's what the numbers are telling us. That's again from the outside looking in, but we know, and certainly from some of the information we've seen, some of the issues at Newcastle and Eddie Howe himself coming out and mentioning PSR in his interviews, which is a fascinating, change of dynamic for managers to start quoting financial situations. We've seen Aston Villa come out and support Manchester City in the associated party transactions case. Their owners are very much of the opinion that those regulations should be lifted and eased off so that they can invest in their club. We've seen the situation at Forest and Everton with points deductions, and as the guys were alluding to, we're not quite sure how much space Chelsea have still got for first-team players, and probably shouldn't be spending, but seem to, again, go against the theory that we think. So there's the kind of almost like the haves and the have-nots there as well as always, and those that can and those that should probably not. I think what's also interesting is those with decisions to make. And we need to look at the table there in January, perhaps more so than we do in the summer window, because ultimately a lot of those decisions are based on the short term to the end of the season and whether or not you are at the risk of relegation or whether or not you are fancying a promotion push. So look at the table at the minute, Southampton and Ipswich, who we both probably expected to be towards the bottom end of the table, both recently promoted. Ipswich spent big in the summer though and have not been in the Premier League for a while. So what do? in terms of their kind of end of season goals. Crystal Palace and Wolves, both in the relegation zone, but also both close to the PSR deficit. And again, that would need to be factored into the calculations based on the data that we can see. And I didn't do this deliberately, but that only leaves Bournemouth out that we've not mentioned yet. And again, on the poll, I don't think nobody had Bournemouth spending at all. So there's an interesting one there. That's not to do them a disservice, but kind of in the middle of the pack, not too bad against the PSR calculation from what we can see. But ultimately, again, wouldn't want to get dragged into a relegation fight. And then I think we've got to look at the top of the Championship too, always in January. It's really fascinating, particularly as a fan of a Championship club. Relegation means a £60 million reduction in revenue. That's the net difference between a TV payment if you finish bottom and a first year parachute payment. But if you've not been in the Premier League for a while, that promotion up can be worth a minimum of 120 million, and sometimes north of that if you can get some good commercial deals alongside it as well. So we know that Leeds, Sheffield United and Burnley will be thereabouts. They're still in receipt of parachute payments. And it pains me to say, coming from the blue side of the city, that Sheffield United went top of the league last night. But we expect those things to happen. The clubs in and around it that haven't been there for a while, what do they do, and where's the risk profiling in their decision making come January? So looking at Sunderland and Middlesbrough in the playoffs, West Brom just on the fringes of the playoffs, and others that might come into that mix. And it really then does become a kind of stick or twist decision. So always good to keep an eye on the Championship in the January window and see who's looking like they might fancy a promotion push. And that goes back to the risk piece for me of financially, how do you view that risk and reward? If you are looking at a deficit of 60 million for relegation, do you spend 20 million in the transfer market that might keep you up? Is the net gain worth the decision and the risk? So I think those are, of course, really interesting conversations that will be happening in boardrooms up and down the country. There are other factors at play, and we could spend a whole probably day's webinar talking about all these things, but just to rattle off a few that the guys have talked about. What does PSR look like in the future? Everything we've seen, we're led to believe that this is fairly, there's a fairly strong argument that in the future the regulations will change, and UEFA have gone to financial sustainability regulations in principle with a squad cost rule, and it's likely that the Premier League and the EFL will follow suit on that in time as well, is my kind of gut feel based on what we've seen in some of the conversations I've had. So the regulatory landscape might change, which is, again, an interesting one to look at in the future. Of course, the Manchester City case is overhanging that as well at the minute. That has to get sorted out, and a resolution has to be done on that because it is linked to the current version of PSR. But if they are to change, we have to consider the dynamics of the City case and how that might impact the whole regulatory framework. Associated party transactions, the ruling that we saw last week and with City a couple of weeks ago, and the vote last week, and what that might mean for shareholder loan changes, with those now having a fair market value interest rate attached to them in the future. The ownership of clubs, which can change the decision making in an instant. So all those PSR numbers that you've seen on the previous slide, the whole dynamic of a club can change with a different owner in a different model, and that can, as I say, really make some impact on transfer market decisions in the short and the long term. The independent regulator for English football, how does that affect the dynamic, and how does that affect spend in the transfer market? And something that I saw just on the train back actually from Newcastle over the weekend is that the future growth and revenue potential, I know Adrian was talking about this earlier, around where some of that growth is coming from, and the Premier League has just secured 17% growth in the international rights for the next deal. The international rights are now bigger than the domestic deal, and the total estimated pot for that TV deal for the next 3 years is around 12.25 billion. So certainly people still want to be associated with Premier League football all the way around the world from a broadcasting point of view, and that'll impact the club's finances as well. And the challenge then, just a couple of final points to conclude on. When we look at the women's game as well, I've said it's a bit of a guessing game with the men's game at times, but the numbers are more readily available. The women's game at the minute is a completely different market, and that data is not necessarily readily available. I'm sure some people on the call will be more into this than I am from the outside looking in, kind of in and around the game. But just to look at some of the numbers there, the last winter window saw 117 deals completed in Europe's top 5 leagues, 140 deals completed in 2023. Record transfer fee of 400,000 at the minute. There's been a few that have been between 200 and 300,000. A lot of the others are undisclosed fees or loan moves, and it's really difficult to get an absolute number on the market. But we have seen spend increase from 0.5 million in 2018 to 2.6 million in 2022, and a leading agent predicting a landmark transfer of £1 million in the next 12 to 18 months. This will also depend, of course, on the larger growth of the game and the commercialisation aspect and future broadcast deals that we all think are coming and will deliver significant growth in value to the women's game as well. So from a predictions point of view, not to swerve the question, but the reality there is kind of anyone's guess at the end of the day. We've seen the numbers, we've seen those that can, those that probably shouldn't, those that may or may not. Time and time again, we've also seen football clubs act emotionally and often irrationally owing to that risk and uncertainty driven by sporting jeopardy. In the men's window, sometimes that's dominated by short-term decision-making based on league position. There's wider factors at play, as we've mentioned, but don't be surprised to see some spend and fairly significant spend for a winter window, particularly those in a relegation battle or fancy in a promotion push or looking to change manager, as the guys alluded to earlier. And of course, for a lot of people on the call as well there, you know, how this plays out behind closed doors and in those negotiations is always fascinating. And those dynamics will have a wider impact on those negotiations between clubs, players and agents. Thank you very much for that, guys. All good. My end, so I think we've got time for a few questions.
Yeah.
I'll
just unshare the screen so we can.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, thanks. That was fantastic, Dan. Really appreciate that. Obviously, you put a lot of work into your presentation, which I'm really grateful for.
Yeah, so we'll just get into the questions then, Dan. There's a sort of a question here from Mark. It's a sort of leading question around Forest. He was saying, but to what extent do you think Nottingham Forest knew what they were doing and planned for a points deduction in order to secure their position, a little bit like you alluded to? I mean, it is black and white, isn't it? And, you know, we've spoke about this before, you know, clubs choose their losses. So, you know, the clubs that have fallen foul of the rules, how conscious do you think they have been of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think whether or not they were planning for a points deduction, I think is one thing to consider. But I think absolutely what they were doing, and I've said this before to both of you, I'm not necessarily convinced regulation's a problem. I think the actors in the system are the problem. And you've seen that with the ownership at Nottingham Forest, and there's egos and power dynamics in there as well. And at the time, there was two or three things happening. One was they ultimately knew what they were spending. And they know what they're being measured against. So it's a deliberate and strategic decision to spend and run the risk. Also, it was at a time where we hadn't seen any cases charged against PSR. So we have to remember that Everton and Forest were the first to be docked points under these regulations, which have been in for a number of years. So I think there's a little bit of that going on as well around that time. Was it has to be deliberate in terms of the spend, and you run the risk. Whether they thought they were not going to get points deducted because of the way the landscape was, maybe. But again, we've seen it with other little things at Forest as well, haven't we? And I think they were fined for a tweet they put out, weren't they? But they refused to take the tweet down anyway. So you get that kind of, you know, that bravado from owners at times. And look, I get that. I understand the way that world works. But yeah, it was a deliberate strategy, and you running that risk, and I think that's what the power dynamics are really interesting then as well when you look into that.
And Dan, I've got a question for you. I'm thinking, you know, can you tell everyone on the record, the Zoom, the young player who's been brought up into the academy, and why is it so beneficial to sell those young players from the academy? What, in accounting terms, what does it mean?
Yeah, so they don't have a cost ultimately to the club. So what happens when a player is signed on a transfer fee is they'll divide the the number of the transfer fee by the number of years of the contract, which gets you that amortization charge per year that is a hot topic around PSR, and that is ultimately a cost to the club. So when you sell a player, you then have to factor in internally all the cost that you've had attached to that player to be able then to generate your accounting profit or loss, which will then impact the bottom line. When you do that with a homegrown player, they don't have that value sat on the books. So ultimately, if you sell that player, it's pure profit. So you don't need to take into account any of those other factors. If you can sell a homegrown player for 50 million, you bank the 50 million. And we've seen numerous examples of that where that's happened. And yeah, morally, I think that's a problem. But ultimately, the finances of it mean that you are recording all that as profit against the bottom line. And clubs are doing that against PSR principally. There's no doubt about that.
And this is sort of leading me into, clubs teaming up and exchanging young players from the academy, or even multi-clubs working players through their systems and through their sister clubs, so that it's an accounting exercise, and that's not going to be good for players, I don't think. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I think the players and the human side of it gets caught in the middle of that, doesn't it? And I know you've got a couple of speakers that will touch upon that later on today as well. Yeah. I'm looking at that in terms of the numbers, but yeah, we've got to be aware of the human behind that, and for some of those young players, that can be really disheartening. And yeah, morally, I think it's not right, but the finances dictate that that's what's happening in the market a lot of the time, and it's purely, again, looking at the regulatory framework and pushing up against it that some clubs have been doing.
Yeah, which is actually, and that conversation there, a nice segue into a question from Paul Widder, and Paul asked Dan, I was wondering what your thoughts are around the Lassana Diarra versus FIFA case and its implications in the transfer market. Now, Tony and I did a webinar on this a couple of weeks ago with the European Football Agents Association, and we've actually discovered a benefit of Brexit, haven't we? It's a genuine. It's a genuine Brexit benefit.
Yeah.
That we are out. The Premier League and the UK market is outside the immediate ramifications of this decision. But maybe you could give us a little flavour of your interpretation, and if you think it will have an impact.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Hope you're keeping well. I'm not a lawyer as well, so I can't get bogged down. I won't try and comment on the legal implications as much, but ultimately, again, this is where that kind of finance and legal world collides, and we've seen a lot more of that in professional football over the years. I think it feels like there are lots of, just on that point and on some wider points that we've mentioned, it feels like there are really significant decisions that are either being made or are being worked through at the minute, and that is one of them that could really shake up, in this case, the transfer market, could really shake up the whole landscape of some of those leagues as well. And I think what's important to remember there is we can't just look at those things in isolation as well. That Diarra case and how it might affect the player movement in the transfer market will also have an impact on clubs themselves, but will have an impact on leagues as a result of that. It'll have an impact on the wider regulatory framework, UEFA, the Premier League, FIFA, and it becomes wages. It becomes against the squad cost rule that's going to look as wages as a factor. So it's really tricky, and those decision makers have to try and piece that together and make sure that it can be as consistent as possible in the way it affects the ecosystem. But it does feel like that is a one thing at the minute, particularly in the player market and player movement, that could have a really seismic impact on the industry. And we might look back on that in 10 years' time and go, that was the moment. And we might look at other things as well that are happening and say, that's the moment, like we have with the formation of the Premier League, the Bosman case. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and we'll certainly signpost everybody on this webinar to the webinar that we did with the AFA guys, because that the guys that we had on were pretty much saying we fully expect a player within the European Union to effectively enforce this law that they're now enabled to do. It's pretty significant.
And Ryan, AFA is European Football Agents Association, just to be clear for everyone.
I did say that. Brilliant.
Thanks, Dan.
Listen, Dan. Absolutely top draw. So we'll come back and see if Dan's predictions are right.
He's got to come on again now. This is going to be a regular feature. It's like,
only if I'm close though, right? So if I don't get an invite back next time, that means
yeah,
that's it. That's true.
Wasn't
Cheers,
anywhere
Dan.
near.
Thanks so much. Thanks.
All right, thanks both. Always a pleasure.